Hi, it's Isabel, and today I am back with part 2 of my best books of 2020. So yesterday I talked to you about my top 3 non-fiction books, and today I'm going to tell you my top 10 fiction books. And I am saying top 10, but it's not really a kind of ranking system. I tried to put them in an order of like how much I like them, but I loved all of them and it was just impossible to come up with any sort of ranking list that made sense. So in no particular order, here are my 10 favourite books that I have read this year. Oh, and before I start, I also wanted to mention that I have read quite a lot of books this year and it was quite hard to get the list down to 10, but I think these 10 are a good kind of representation of the type of books that I have read and enjoyed this year. And I think I'm going to start off with the only short story collection that has made it into my top 10, and it is A Registry of My Passage upon the Earth by Daniel Mason. This book I think I've also talked quite a lot about already, like with most of these books, but of course the idea of this video is just to reiterate my love for these books. So this book is, as I said, short stories, and I think almost all of them have a historical setting and also have some kind of magical realism element to them. And that is also what I really enjoyed about this book, because a lot of these stories are kind of about scientific exploration or advancement. There is one that I particularly love that is set in the rainforest. There's one about a female balloonist that I also really liked and that I still remember. I think they really nicely combine their kind of historical feel with also kind of a magical feel, and they mix really well. And just the atmosphere that is created in these stories is something that has really stayed with me, and I think that's also why I love these stories so much. And even though all of these stories are very different and are about completely different characters, they still felt very coherent because they all share that same kind of atmosphere. And that is something that I really look for in a short story collection. Like, I want the stories to feel kind of connected, even if technically they aren't, but they all gave me the same kind of feeling. And short story collections don't often make it into my favorites because there are usually some that I enjoy a lot and then other stories that I don't really care for. But I don't think that there was any story in here that I really disliked, which is why I think this collection deserved a spot in my top 10 of 2020. The next book also feels kind of like a short story collection, even though according to the cover it is a novel, and it is Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams. And I don't know if you can see, but the cover says it's a novel. I'm not sure if I agree, but let me first tell you what this book is about. This really short novella imagines Einstein's dreams while he was working on his theory of time. And so these dreams all imagine different ways of experiencing time. And all of these dreams are of course connected by the fact that they are dreamt by Einstein, and you also have some moments in between where you follow a fictionalized Einstein as he goes about his day talking to his friends, working in the patent office that he was working at the time. But the reason why I say I'm not quite sure if I would really count this as a novel is because it has that short story feel to it, because you have all of these different dreams and they're all kind of set up in a way that you kind of get to know a town and like some of the people in that town, and you just learn how time works in that town, in that dream, and how the people there experience time. It uses these fictional sci-fi-ish stories to say something about the way we live and the way we experience time in our everyday lives, which isn't always linear or like consistent. And I think it really portrays that very well. And also makes you just think of how you think of time. That's what I really enjoyed about Einstein's Dreams. And I still think back to some of the dreams presented in here and kind of start thinking about what it would be like if time worked that way. And I think that's always kind of a sure way for me to know that a book is a favourite, if it stays with me and if I'm just randomly reminded of it and I think of it still months after having read it. My next favourite is really a good reminder for myself that I should really read more of my favourite authors' backlists, because it is A Summer of Drowning by John Burnside. I was initially interested in this because I read another one of John Burnside's novels, so I just wanted to read more from John Burnside. And A Summer of Drowning is a book that is set on an, I think, Arctic Circle Island, and we follow a young woman who lives there with her mother, and one summer there are multiple people who drown and or disappear, and she is kind of involved in that and also kind of tries to figure out what happened. But it really isn't a kind of crime novel. It's much more about these people who live there, and especially about this protagonist who's a really interesting character to read about. And it's a very calm novel, but that also really explores the kind of tensions that exist in everyday life. And this one, again, I loved because of the atmosphere that it creates, and also because the protagonist is just such a fascinating character to read about. I feel like my light is changing a lot again today, so I'm really sorry if you're like flickering back and forth between darker and brighter shots again. It happened once again before. I don't know why it's happening, so I can't really do anything against it, so I hope it's not too distracting. Either way, moving on, I have a rather recent favourite. I think I only just read this month, and it is The Victorian Chaise-longue by, let me get this right, Marghanita Laski. This one is a Persephone classic. Persephone, as I've mentioned a few times before, publish kind of forgotten, out-of-print classics by female authors from the 20th century. And this particular novel was written in the 1950s, and I think the modern day timeline is set in the 1950s, but then there's also a more historical timeline, because this book features time travel. So the titular Victorian Chaise-longue is a chaise-longue that enables time travel, and the protagonist whom we are following in the modern day timeline is a woman who is sick and on bed rest, and they kind of put her on this Victorian chaise-longue and she falls asleep, and when she wakes up again, she's, I think, in the 1850s, and people there think that she's a different person because she wakes up in a different body. And this book made so many interesting commentaries on women's lives and their possibilities in the two different times that it's set in, and it was also just really fascinating to follow. And it's a really quick read. I think it's not even 100 pages, and it completely drew me in, and I flew through this in basically one sitting because it was just so interesting and I needed to know what was going to happen next. Because I've only just read it recently, I can't really say yet if this one is going to stay with me for a long time, but I already kind of feel an urge to reread it, so I feel confident to include it in my favourites. The next book is been a while since I've read it, so I'm sorry if I don't get the plot quite right, but I will try my best. And it is The Witchway Tree by Elizabeth Crook. This one is a western. I feel like every year I have at least one western that ends up in my favourites because I just really like the genre for some reason, especially if, like this one, it is a modern take on a western, because this one follows a girl who I think lives with her brother. It is her half brother, but anyway, those two actually live alone because their mother has been attacked by a panther and their father shortly after also died, and she has just put it in her mind that she will find and kill that panther, and that's kind of what kicks off this story. And this one again has really fun, quirky characters. I really enjoyed following them throughout the story, and like some of my other favourites, this one also has a really badass female protagonist that I absolutely loved reading about. The next book I don't have with me because I borrowed it from the library, but I will definitely have to go out and get myself a copy of it because I enjoyed it that much. And it is Mexican Gothic. I feel like so many people have talked about Mexican Gothic recently. There has been a really big hype on BookTube and also Bookstagram, but I can only say that it is absolutely deserved. So Mexican Gothic is basically a modern Gothic story set, I'm not quite sure anymore, I think in the 1950s? It follows a protagonist who goes to see her cousin who has recently been wed and then moved to this big mansion out in the country, but that cousin has mysteriously fallen ill and our protagonist goes there to kind of try and figure out what's happening there. And I loved how many Gothic elements this novel included. It had the great atmosphere, the creepy mansion. You weren't quite sure if you could trust the protagonist's perceptions or if she was maybe going slightly insane, and I just loved all of that. The reason why this made it into my favourites is definitely because of the twist at the end. It completely shocked me while I also absolutely loved it. It went into exactly the direction that I didn't expect, but in hindsight I wanted it to go. I can't really tell you why I loved the ending so much because that would obviously be a spoiler, but it just did a thing that I found absolutely fascinating and that I just really enjoyed. That's why it was kind of elevated for me from just normal Gothic retelling or like Gothic novel to one of my absolute favourites. Moving on, we have another book where it's not very surprising that it made it to my favourites because it's from an author that I already really enjoy, and it is Dead Astronauts by Jeff VanderMeer. This year I read both Born and Dead Astronauts, and the reason because I'm saying that is because these are both set in the same world. I have previously read the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff VanderMeer that I have really enjoyed. I am kind of obsessed with Annihilation. So obviously I had to pick up more of his books, and Dead Astronauts came out this year, I'm pretty sure. And it is, as I said, set in a different world than the Southern Reach trilogy, but in the same world as Born, where a tech company has kind of taken over the world. It's kind of a dystopian world because civilization as we know it has ceased to exist, and there are kind of strange beings around and everybody's just trying to survive somehow. As always, I kind of struggle to explain Jeff VanderMeer's books, so I'm really sorry if this didn't make a lot of sense. But that is actually also one of the things that I quite enjoy about Jeff VanderMeer's books. They're always kind of strange and you're never quite sure what's going on and you have to kind of figure out what's going on as you read on. Dead Astronauts was so strange that I just absolutely loved it. As I said, I can't really explain what's going on in here, but I enjoyed being very confused and just following along what was going on. This is definitely one that I will have to reread because I certainly didn't catch everything that was going on in my first read, but I enjoyed the atmosphere that was created. I enjoyed the kind of many questions that I had while reading it, and there were some characters that I found really interesting to see and to follow. So yeah, I can't really explain properly why I enjoyed it. I just know that I loved it, and it is for sure one that I want to reread soon. My next favourite is also, I think, the longest book that I have read this year, and it is The Terror by Dan Simmons. This just shows that I should read more long books because I tend to really enjoy them once I actually get to them, because this one is, I think, over 800 pages, but I enjoyed every single page of it. So The Terror follows the Franklin expedition that I've already mentioned yesterday, because Erebus by Michael Palin also follows the Franklin expedition, but The Terror is a fictionalized account of what happened to the Franklin expedition. And it's certainly fictional because there is some like supernatural things going on. And this one also for sure has a superb atmosphere throughout. It creates kind of a sense of dread and you never know what's going to happen next. And because it is set in the Arctic and people are frozen in on these ships, you really feel like the darkness and how cold it is kind of seeping in. And then there's of course also the fact that they are being hunted by a giant polar bear. And I feel like The Terror definitely isn't for everybody, but I think if you enjoy, I would say, kind of slow-paced horror that is kind of slowly unfolding, and also creature horror, this might be one that you would enjoy. Apparently that is just exactly the brand of horror that I really tend to enjoy, and that's why The Terror made it onto my favourites. It is also why the next book is on my favourites list. The book I'm talking about is Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. And this one, as the subtitle says, is a ghost story, and it is set on an Arctic island. We see a theme here. I apparently like Arctic islands. And it follows a young man who takes on a job on this island. I forget what his job was. But either way, he travels there with like a team of young men. But he, for some reason, ends up being there alone in winter. And there is this legend that a ghost is haunting this island because of something that happened in the past. And in this one you're also not sure if something supernatural is actually going on or if the protagonist is just slowly going insane, because it deals a lot with the isolation and the loneliness that the protagonist feels and how that influences him. Also, again, the dark and the cold surroundings are really taking a toll on him. And because it's written mostly in diary entries, you really get into the protagonist's head and you get to experience the things that he's experiencing with him. I think The Terror and Dark Matter have really similar vibes to them, and I really want to find more books like these. So if you have any recommendations for me, please leave them in the comments, because I want to read more horror like that, because apparently that is just what made it into my favourites this year. I do, however, for my last favourite, have a book that is completely different to those two and that is not horror, and it is Weather by Jenny Offill. I apparently liked this book so much that I read it twice this year, because the first time I read it I just had a feeling that it was brilliant, but then a few weeks later I realised that I had already kind of forgotten everything about it, which was strange because, as I said, I felt like it was really brilliant and I loved it. So I let a few months go by, and then I think last month or this month I read it again. And I can now pinpoint why I had this feeling that it was brilliant but had already forgotten everything about it. And it's because of the way that this book is written. So in this book you're basically in the head of the protagonist, and she is a woman who has a family. She has a husband and a son. She's working at a library, and she also has this kind of old friend of hers who has a kind of doomsday podcast, and she starts helping her with her emails and kind of replying to questions that she gets. She also has a kind of difficult relationship with the rest of her family, with her very religious mother and her brother, who is a drug addict. But all of these things you are never explicitly told. You just, as I said, you are in her head. So she never really explains what's going on or explains herself, because she's not telling you the story of her life. You're just following her along as she goes about her daily business. So instead of a coherent story, what you get in this book is just a lot of thoughts that don't really have a lot of context, but that really speak to the times that we are living in. So there's a lot of climate anxiety in here. She worries for her future and the future of her son. She also worries about kind of everyday things, and yeah, it really feels like you're just following along the thoughts of somebody living today. And I think that's what makes this book so brilliant. And there are so many passages that I highlighted because I wanted to revisit them and think about them more in depth later. And I have a feeling that I will probably also reread this one again next year, because I just can't get enough of this, and I think experiencing this book again and again gives you something new every time. And that's it. Those were my 10 favourite books that I have read in 2020. If you have read any really good books, have found any new favourites this year, please let me know in the comments. I always love seeing what other people have read and enjoyed. And I think the end of the year is always a really good time to reflect on what we have done, what we have read, and find our favourite moments of the year, especially this year. I think it's really nice to think back on all of the nice things that also happened. If you're watching this as it goes live, I hope you have a lovely New Year's Eve and Happy New Year! Thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!